Hi, folks. Welcome to Introduction to Psychology. Okay, we are going to be using a textbook called Introduction to Psychology. It's the 12th edition. Author is James Kalat. So let's get right into it. So today in this lecture, we will go through this first chapter, which is an introduction to the topic. Each chapter will have a lecture associated with it, so you can get the whole course right here online, all the lectures. We'll be using the slides provided by the textbook company, and I will periodically intersperse my own thoughts, of course, here and there, share what I think is the most important stuff, or highlight things, or add things I think might be missing. Feel free to email me if you have a question about anything, or if you're not taking this course, you can just drop a question in the comments. Okay, so without further ado, let's get right into it. I'll give you my kind of brief introduction to the subject of psychology. It's very large, it's very complicated, it is unwieldy, it's going to feel confusing. You're going to feel each chapter, you're going to be asked to learn something totally different, and that's going to be hard. It's going to be a challenge because the chapters are very different. They don't exactly build upon each other because psychology is such a broad area that it's okay, now we're talking about neuroscience, now we're talking about memory, now we're talking about this, now we're talking about that. A lot, but you won't understand it all. So that's just don't feel bad if you're not getting everything. That's not the point. The point is this class is supposed to be a foundation class for you for the rest of your life. This is supposed to be the beginning of your psychological journey. And as time goes on, you can add to your knowledge base that you're going to be building up, hopefully, in this class. Okay, so the number one thing so how do we tie together all these disparate ideas in psychology? So for me, the way we do that is with a little phrase, a little mantra that I like to use. I'll come back to throughout the course to help us understand what human psychology is. And our mantra is, humans need a tribe like bees need a hive. Humans need a tribe like bees need a hive. This little slogan, mantra, saying, it will hopefully help you sort of understand what fundamentally humans are, right? So if you were trying to figure out what kind of thing a dog was or understand dog psychology, if you didn't understand that dogs were pack animals, if you tried to understand dog psychology just by watching a single dog in a cage, you would not be very successful, right? So so many different aspects of human behavior, self-esteem, depression, anxiety, aggression, religion, politics, sports, basic way we perceive the world, all these things are shaped by our evolutionary history, millions of years, in some ways hundreds of millions of years, beginning with mammal evolution, of millions, hundreds of millions, and even millions of years as primates, as humans. Evolution is sort of been pushing us in certain directions, so we'll try and understand that as we go along. But that'll be our kind of unifying theme for the course. All right, let's get over some of these. Okay, so chapter objectives discuss three major philosophical issues important to psychology. Psychology emerges out of philosophy. So some of the philosophers and humans really for thousands of years have been thinking about psychological questions. They just haven't been doing psychology as a science, because doing it as a science means taking measurements, data, and so that didn't really happen until the 1800s. Philosophy has a lot of psychological questions that made their way into philosophy, but also religion, art, literature, every story, every classic story. I mean, read Shakespeare. There's a lot of human psychology in there, and he got a lot of things correct. Not everything is correct. He didn't understand everything. And we now understand in some ways more because of modern science. But there was a lot of good psychology done prior to 1850 or 1879 when the first psychology lab was started. Distinguish psychology from psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Give some examples of specializations in psychology for both research and practice. Explain why early psychologists were eager for a great man theory to revolutionize the field. Describe the research interests of early psychologists. List differences between psychology and its early days. Explain why early psychologists avoided the study of conscious experience. Well, that one's easy. It's pretty much impossible to study and very difficult. We're just now really starting to crack that nut. Okay, Unit 1. General points about psychology. Psychology is the systematic study of behavior and experience. Not the best definition, but it is fine. I would prefer a definition that has something to do with collecting data and doing experiments. Because if we're not doing that, we're not really doing psychology in the proper sense, the way we understand it now, but that's okay. That's what systematic kind of stands for. Some general statements, aspects of psychology, aspects of behavior depend on a variety of things, such as age, health, past experience, and either whether one is asleep or awake. So in psychology or in science in general, when we say something causes something else, we say it's a causal factor. We don't say one thing just causes something else because in psychology, everything is what we call multifactorial, means there are always multiple causes. Most famously, there's sort of nature versus nurture, or environment and genetics, however you want to think about that. But within that category, there's many, many, many different aspects of environment, and many, many different genes and combinations of genes and ways in which different aspects of the environment interact with different genes. So everything is always multifactorial. Progress in psychology and research depends on good measurement. If we're not measuring, we're not doing science. Of course, measuring and doing statistics. Confidence and conclusions should depend. Here's some of the philosophical stuff, some early philosophical questions that are relevant to psychology in some ways. Free will versus determinism. Basically, determinism says every event has a cause. It feels like we make decisions freely. Science is firmly on the side of determinism. Dualism is the idea that the mind is separate from the brain but controls it and the body. Monism says conscious experience is inseparable from the brain. Obviously, modern science is firmly in this camp for the most part. Nature versus nurture is this question of what causes behavior. Is it our environment or is it something within us? John Locke was a philosopher of the Enlightenment who famously said that the mind was a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. However, that idea, which was important and revolutionary at the time, to say that, look, we're not born with certain moral beliefs, certain prejudices, shaped by our experience and by our environment. That was a really powerful idea at the time. But nowadays, we know that evolution has shaped us with certain instincts and certain tendencies and things like that. Okay, so here's a little pie chart to show us some of the things that psychologists do. Over here, we've got private practice, then half, hospitals and mental health facilities and schools. So psychologists could essentially be doing psychotherapy in a private practice setting, in a clinic setting, in a school setting. The psychologists work for governments in a variety of capacities. I'll talk about that a little later in this presentation. And then they do other things. Notably, it's worth mentioning that psychologists work for large social media companies to help these tech companies figure out how to make their products more addicting. There's something called user experience research, where psychologists research how people are using the products and research ways for tech companies to make their products more attractive or more helpful to people, also more addicting. Distinctions: clinical psychology versus psychiatry versus other mental health professionals. Psychiatry, start in the middle. These are medical doctors, but they also have 4 years of residency training in psychology, essentially training in medication. So these people deal with emotional disturbances by prescribing drugs. They do not do therapy with their patients. Clinical psychologists, these are people that have a master's degree or a PhD in clinical psychology. They specialize in talk therapy and behavior therapy, helping clients with psychological problems. Other mental health professionals also do the same thing. These are primarily licensed clinical social workers, LISW, typically have a master's degree but could have a PhD. We also have counselors. These are people that typically graduate from a counselor education program, again, typically with a master's degree, but sometimes with a PhD as well. Forensic psychologists are employed by courts as sort of expert witnesses. And you have some people who do various kinds of therapy that are outside this clinical psychology, counselor education, social work framework, people trained in, say, Freudian psychology or Jungian psychology or something like that. IO psychologists, or industrial organizational psychology, They study people at work, hiring and firing, as it's sometimes called. What's the best procedure for hiring the best people? What's the best way to fire people? What's the best way to train people? What's the best way to keep people happy? How do we keep people in our organization? Those types of things. Government organizations also hire IO psychologists as well. Military psychologists, they're similar to IO, but they work in the military. School psychologists, they may do research on the conditions of what's happening in schools, essentially, or they might be working directly with students, providing therapeutic services, identifying and planning for educational needs. Other sort of community psychologists would include people like professors, researchers, program directors, policy developers. With a PhD in psychology, that can be attractive. It's not a direct path. You can't just like, okay, I'm now going to be a policy director because I have my PhD. It's not like a guaranteed job path, but with a PhD in psychology, you may be, the path could open up to a variety of different potential occupations. Developmental psychology is an academic discipline. People in this discipline study and try to learn how people develop. Learning and motivation is another academic discipline, as is cognitive psychology. So we'll talk more about all these as we go on through the course. Cognitive psychologists study sort of the fundamental nuts and bolts about how humans process information, how we make decisions, how we solve problems, how we produce language, how language works, how thought works, relationship between thought and language, etc. Biological psychologists study the biological foundations of behavior. Here we're talking about neurons. How do neurons work? We're talking about neurotransmitters. We're talking about neural networks or sort of different patterns of connection between all our neurons. We've got about 80 billion, so there's a lot of different networks, a lot of different neural networks that are responsible for individual concepts, individual memories, movement patterns, all kinds of different things. And we've got the different structures within the brain, but then we also have our endocrine system as well, which is our different organs that produce hormones. So biological psychology is focused on the central nervous system, which is our brain, the peripheral nervous system, which is the stuff attached to the brain by neurons, as well as the endocrine system. Evolutionary psychologists try to good stories about the origins of human behavior. People are sort of incorporate evolutionary psychology into their other sort of research that they do, but it could just be a discipline by itself. And you have social psychologists, cross-cultural psychologists. Social psychologists study how an individual influences others and how others influence an individual. So big things in social psychology, the big kind of questions of human nature, human behavior, trauma, religion, politics, love, relationships, all that stuff. Cross-cultural psychologists study psychology across different cultures. And there are some important differences, and we'll come to those as the course goes on. Should you major in psychology? So a degree in psychology is not a guaranteed path, especially if it's just a bachelor's degree, but it could prepare you for a wide variety of other graduate programs or fields. Psychology courses prepare people to evaluate evidence, organize and write papers, handle statistics, listen carefully to what people say, respect cultural differences. People with bachelor's degree in psychology enter a wide variety of careers or continue their education in professional schools. Those with advanced degree in psychology have additional possibilities depending on their area of specialization. So, general rule, don't spend a whole bunch of money getting a degree if you are not clear exactly what kind of job you are going to get with that degree. Okay, so a little bit about the history of psychology. This is kind of second part of this first chapter, and we're gonna zip through this a bit. We are zipping through it. It's just an introduction. The other chapters will be longer. We'll be getting into a lot more detail. Early era of psychology: astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, as sciences developed gradually over centuries. Psychology began as a deliberate attempt to start a new science. Highly ambitious field with goals of amassing knowledge that would quickly be comparable to other sciences. So, since the Renaissance and especially since the Enlightenment in Europe, you essentially had the birth of a wide variety of sciences and rapid progression in scientific knowledge, but there was still one kind of thing that remained very much kind of mysterious that had not ever it never sort of been able to get its arms around and sort of studying, and that was us, ourselves, human psychology, nature. So 1800s, people start wanting to figure this out. Here is a little timeline. We've got various, oopsies. We have various events in human history plotted here. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit more. So we got the European Renaissance, 1400s to 1500s. Rene Descartes, 1649. So what are some, another important philosopher, David Hume. So by now, philosophers like David Hume are trying to think more kind of scientifically about human nature. 1776, U.S. Declaration of Independence. Late 1700s, philosopher Immanuel Kant is writing around this time, and that kind of marks the end of the Enlightenment. The 1800s are considered the Industrial Revolution, although the same kind of processes that define the Enlightenment, the expansion of democracy and human rights, these are still ongoing. They're still ongoing to this day. So the Enlightenment isn't over. We're far from enlightened as a species, but as a historical period, once we get into 1800s, we're in the Industrial Revolution. So late 1700s, a fellow named Mesmer introduces something called hypnosis. That's relevant because Freud, who was an important early psychologist, started out as a hypnotist. 1843, Dorothea Dix campaigns for better treatment of mentally ill. So, prior to this, people with mental illness were seen as being essentially possessed by ghosts, things like that. 1856, Mendel discovers basic principles of genetics. 1859, so around this middle of the 1800s, 1859 is the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, momentous occasion in human history when we can actually have a real way of understanding who we are and where we came from. This sort of really kickstarts our new understanding of science and ourselves and the natural world. And there is a lot of good psychology. Darwin wasn't a psychologist, but he was a very careful observer and just built into the fundamental idea of evolution, the idea that, survival of the fittest. Well, Darwin understood very clearly that process didn't just work on physical characteristics. Yes, the animals that can run fast and that are good at hunting and are aggressive, they survive, sure. But survival also has to do with cooperation and curiosity and ability to learn and intelligence and all kinds of other things, right? So Darwin was very much aware. He was the first person to talk about the psychology of morality and the psychology of empathy. He said that morality would evolve in any social creature eventually. So Darwin had a lot of insight into psychology based on his theory of evolution, probably more so than anyone at the time. And it's taken the discipline of psychology a while to actually catch up with him. Okay, around this time, Karl Marx also publishes his famous book on capitalism called Capital, as well as the Communist Manifesto, profoundly influential book in terms of world politics. Ebbinghaus, so 1879, 20 years after Darwin's publication of Origin of Species, we have our first psychology laboratory, Willem Wundt. He's bringing people in, he's showing them different objects, colors, and he's asking them to talk about their experience, and he's recording their answers. So that's a huge deal. His experiments were not fantastic. They didn't actually tell us very much about human psychology, but because of the fact that he was starting to collect data, other people could come along behind him and improve upon his methodology. So as soon as you have like a prototype, then you can start to improve on it. Once you have the first computer, maybe as big as a house, but that's okay. Now we can make it better. We can make it faster. And now we have computers that fit in our pockets. As soon as you have the first airplane, now you can make it better. Right? So now we have the first experiments. Now we can start to do better experiments. We can actually start to learn things. So we're seeing kind of this, that's about the last 20 years of the 1900s, 1879 to 1900. There is a lot of progress in psychology, big things. 1885, Ebbinghaus's theory of memory. 1890, founding of the American Journal of Psychology. That was 1887. 1890, William James's Principles of Psychology. 1892, first convention of the American Psychological Association. 1896, University of Pennsylvania establishes first psychological clinic. 1900, Freud's interpretation of dreams, The Rise of Psychoanalysis, is published. So A lot of stuff is happening. Freud is far and away the biggest name in the late 1800s, early 1900s. 1905, Binet introduces the first IQ test. 1907, first color picture movie, first motion picture with sound. 1908, cars. So the world is making rapid progress to the modern form, as is the discipline of psychology. So Freud is very dominant, but a new school of thinking is starting to come into play. 1911, you have the first description of schizophrenia, but also in 1911, you have Thorndike's first studies on operant conditioning. These would eventually turn, by 1938, into B.F. Skinner's theory of behaviorism, or the behavior of organisms. Skinner was building on the work of Pavlov, who was doing classical conditioning in 1910, and Thorndike, 1911. Founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. 1946, first electronic digital computer. This is a big deal because as computers improve, it changes the way we understand the brain, right? This sort of computer science revolution, the revolution in the way people think about the brain. People start to think about the brain as a sort of computer, as an information processor. And also computers in this sort of modern age unlocks a lot of new research methodologies. So, these first computers weren't super useful, but by the time we get up here, Birth of Cognitive Psychology in 1956, which is really only 46 to 56, 10 years later, now we have a new discipline of psychology. In between that, we've got the discovery of REM sleep. We've got Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA in the 50s. So a lot of stuff is happening. Drugs in the 50s for schizophrenia and depression. We also have the rise of humanistic psychology. So we have some early schools of psychology, which we'll get into later in this presentation, like structuralism and functionalism. Then we've got psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis is very much dominant for a long time. Then behaviorism comes along, and we'll do a whole chapter on behaviorism, so you don't have to know everything now. Behaviorism essentially gives way to cognitive psychology in terms of understanding the basics of human nature. And then Freudian psychoanalysis gives way to more humanistic approaches and more cognitive therapy approaches. 1963, Milgram's first studies on obedience. 1975, Elizabeth Loftus' early studies on memory distortion. So by the time we're in the 60s and 70s, that's about 60 years, 60s to now. 60, 70 years is kind of the modern form of psychology, modern discipline of psychology. So let's go back, and so we will cover this modern stuff more in depth. We'll get do a whole chapter on behaviorism and cognitive psychology and all that stuff. The rest of this chapter, we will talk just a little bit about some of these early psychologists. All right, 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, first psychology laboratory. He believed that sensations and feelings were the basic elements of experience, and wanted to try and quantify those to say, okay, let's try and pick apart experience and separate it into these fundamental sensations and feelings. He discovered that, experience is partly under voluntary control. We can shift our attention from one element to another to get different experience. To test his ideas about experience, he asked his subjects to engage in introspection. So he would show them a color or an object and ask them to introspect, to tell him what was in their conscious experience, and then he would write it down. Structuralism sort of evolved out of Wundt's work. Titchener was a student of Wundt. It's an attempt to describe the structures that compose the mind. So when we look at this object, okay, we can say that there is yellow and there's gray, and there's also this lemony shape. Not super useful, but it was a beginning, and we made progress from there. William James, in his 1890 book, Principles of Psychology, this is a little bit more philosophical and rather than say experimental, but he's thinking about things in much the same way a modern psychologist would. So that's kind of what separates his work from, say, earlier work by philosophers. And he's sometimes considered a psychologist, but really he's more of a philosopher. Sometimes he's considered a philosopher. And many of the questions that continue to dominate psychology, his school of thought was called functionalism. And with functionalism, we focus on what the mind does rather than what it is or how we produce useful behaviors. He was trying to just figure out what are the basic functions of the mind. And this is kind of, in some ways, a little bit of an evolutionary approach. Okay. From there, we had search for early laws of learning. This would be behaviorism. Thorndike and Watson were early behaviorists. They wanted simple laws for predicting behavior and learning. Some of those early theories endured and became a school of thought known as behaviorism and are still very relevant to modern psychology. That stuff, not super relevant. Darwin was an early psychologist, as we've discussed. He was studying animal intelligence. In some ways, William James did have a lot of insight into a lot of aspects of human psychology, as did Freud. In terms of early writers who really kind of were getting somewhere, Darwin, Freud, William James, they were all sort of getting at important aspects of human psychology. Of course, Darwin wasn't doing psychological studies, but way back when he figured out that he understood the psychology of morality, for example, and mainstream psychology didn't get back around to this topic until well over 100 years later. The study of morality has really only become a thing in the last, say, 25 years of modern psychology. So Darwin was doing a lot of really good sort of thinking about human psychology. He was able to do that because he kind of had the right approach to trying to understand human psychology. Remember, humans need a tribe like bees need a hive. Okay. This is, comparative psychologists in terms of trying to understand different intelligences in animal species. They were trying to rank animals from like smartest to dullest, and that's not super useful. It's still sort of operating from this old paradigm of like God at the top, and then angels below God, and then humans, and then animals, and you can separate the animals into the different kinds of animals. So not a super useful framework for understanding things. A lot of times when we're having trouble understanding something, it's because we have the wrong framework. So a lot of this early psychology was trying to get to the right framework so that we could actually make progress. So how to detour a problem, how do animals get around something, you can compare the way different animals do that. Can animals delay their responses, things like that. Really good book on animal intelligence by the fantastic animal behaviorist psychologist. That's his name. The book is called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? Author's name is Franz de Waal. If you're interested in animal intelligence, cannot recommend that book enough. Very important early figure. He talked about, so he started off as a hypnotist and he was trying to hypnotize people's problems away. But eventually he realized that people benefited from just talking. So he would have people lay down, they would close their eyes, they'd lay on a couch, he would sit behind them, and they would essentially talk about their early childhood. And he found that made people feel better. Even people who had physical ailments. There was one woman who couldn't walk, and all of a sudden she's starting to be able to walk after call it the talking cure. So he pioneered this idea that early childhood tensions or conflicts affect behavior in adulthood. He talked about the importance of dreams. He talked about the importance of the unconscious mind, unconscious conflicts from our childhood, unconscious motivations, and the importance of bringing those things into conscious awareness in terms of healing. He thought dreams were very important, methodology for doing that. He talked about sex openly, which was not really done at the time, and how that's a fundamental feature of human psychology and how it is involved in a lot of different aspects of human behavior. So a lot of ideas in the modern world that we take for granted, in some ways came from Freud. I mean, he was the only person they came from, but nowadays we don't really talk much about Freud, humanistic psychology, essentially, and sort of modern psychotherapy was obviously influenced by early Freudian psychotherapy. Then early Freudian psychotherapy essentially got sort of revolutionized by humanistic therapy, where we'll talk more about that later when we talk about therapy, but treating people more respectfully, sort of recognizing the potential for positive human growth in humans. The modern format of doing therapy, where we sit facing each other and look at each other and affirm, where the therapist's job is to affirm and validate, make the client feel understood. Even the term client comes from humanistic therapy rather than patient. humanistic psychology kind of changed the way psychotherapy was done, and then you had some new techniques with cognitive psychology, behaviorism sort of added into this kind of humanistic approach. That's kind of the modern psychotherapy is about. Recent trends: most psychologists today attempt to answer more limited questions. Basic research is study that seeks theoretical knowledge for its own sake. Applied research is study dealing with practical problems. Cognitive psychology, study of thought and knowledge, has gradually gained prominence since the 1960s because technology has improved and we've figured out how to answer certain questions, essentially. Rapidly growing fields: neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, positive psychology. Not really rapidly growing fields, to be honest. These fields have all been well established for a long time. I would say of all these, health psychology and the study of stress and trauma is probably the field that is sort of out of these things that is rapidly growing at the moment, but also maybe neuroscience is also rapidly growing, especially with the the discovery of AI and how that is leading to new understandings of the way consciousness works and the way information processing works. So that is definitely going to be, if not already, going to be an expanding field. But these have all been around for a long time at this point. If by rapidly growing, let's say rapidly growing over the past few decades. Okay. Now that the lesson has ended, you should have learned how to discuss 3 major philosophical issues important to psychology, distinguish psychology from psychiatry and psychoanalysis, give examples of specializations in psychology for both research and practice, explain why early psychologists were eager for a great man or theory. That's just how people thought things were done back then. Describe research interests of early psychologists, this difference between psychology in its early days, psychology today. Explain why early psychologists avoided the study of conscious experience. I think we did most of that. Avoided it because they didn't really have a good way of doing it. So, as a reminder, humans need a tribe like bees need a hive. We will get into everything that has been discussed in this lesson in great detail over the next 15 units. Okay, thanks for watching to this point. If you are in my course at Hawken College, you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. If you're just watching this randomly, feel free to drop a question in the comments below. All right, I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks.